Good morning. Hello, my name is Chris Jones. I'm with the University of Arizona Cooperative Extension in Gila County. Welcome to our next edition of the Garden and Country Extension webinar. Today we have Allie McAlexander with us. She's going to talk about bark beetles in Arizona and everything you want to know, signs and symptoms, and identification of native and non-native bark beetles. So if you're new to this, you're going to learn stuff you didn't know. And if you know all about bark beetles, we're still going to learn something. A little bit about the webinar series. I do these weekly on Zoom. Try to keep them under an hour. Depends on our speaker and our questions. Sometimes we'll run over. 60 minutes or less, Thursdays at 11. We feature a variety of horticulture and natural resource topics relevant to the environmental conditions and residential concerns of Gila County. And certainly anybody else who's interested in what's going on. But bark beetles where we live and throughout Arizona and the West, we've got issues. A recording of this will be posted at this website, extension.arizona.edu/Gila. Got a page called Garden and Country Extension, and just open that up and you'll find them. University of Arizona is an equal opportunity affirmative action institution. Here's our agenda for today. Thank you for everybody who came and logged in. Have about that 10 minutes ahead of time for login. Here I am giving you the welcome, Chris Jones, your moderator. Here in just a moment, we will have our speaker talk about bark beetles in Arizona, signs, symptoms, and identification of native and non-native bark beetles with Allie McAlexander, forest health specialist. She's got about a half-hour presentation. I'll give an evaluation link and a little poll to see how you heard about this presentation. Help us out with our promotion. We'll continue with a question and answer session with Allie. Any questions you've got, and we'll seek to wrap up by noon and get us off to lunch. Here is our presenter, Allie McAlexander. She is Arizona's forest health specialist. She works for the Arizona Department of Forestry and Fire Management. She comes to us from Oregon, and well, we all had fires this year, so whether it was smoky here or smoky there, it was just a bad year. But we're going to talk about beetles who contribute to fires a bit too. Allie, that's it. I'm going to go ahead and stop my share screen. You go ahead and pull up your screen, and I'll make sure I hear you well, and we get started here.
Hello, I'm Allie McAlexander, the Forest Health Specialist with the Arizona Department of Forestry and Fire Management. And today I'm going to be discussing bark beetles. To begin, bark beetles are often considered to be the most destructive forest insects as they can create landscape levels of mortality. Although they can be devastating, most are native species, which means they should be here and they're vital to the creation of healthy functioning forests. They act much like fire through their disturbances. They come in and kill trees, breaking up the landscape. They can help increase tree species diversity, size diversity, and they can also help create gap formations. They create snags that make homes for wildlife, and the beetles and their larvae are a food source for woodpeckers and other animals and insects. When they are at endemic levels, which are lower, more natural population levels, they help create all those characteristics that are important to a healthy landscape. The beetles are killing trees that are already weakened. However, many of the current outbreaks we are seeing are unprecedented, as we have never seen them before, and they can often be linked to human activities. Human activities such as creating denser forests through fire suppression. In these dense forests, trees are water stressed and nutrient stressed because they're heavily competing against each other for these things. Thus, stressed trees are easier hosts for the bark beetles to attack. In addition, the lack of fires has led to stands that aren't broken up. So all the trees are similar in size, making them more susceptible to bark beetles. The bark beetles can get their populations up and going in these dense stands. So where previously the beetles would run into an opening where maybe a fire was and the beetles no longer have a food source, or maybe there's smaller diameter trees that they aren't interested in. These previous management techniques have contributed to creating these contiguous landscapes of an all-you-can-eat buffet for the beetles. In addition, warming climate allows the beetles to have more generations per year, and the warmer temps can increase stress on the trees. Even if moisture seemed good in warmer weather, these trees will need more water. So overall, a lot of these big landscape level unprecedented outbreaks can be tied into past management activities. Okay, now that we covered that native bark beetles should be here and are vitally important for healthy functioning ecosystems, we can go ahead and talk a little bit about general bark beetle information. So they belong to the order Coleoptera, subfamily Scolytinae, and there are about 6,000 species worldwide. In the southwest, bark beetles do attack every native conifer, and there is often more than one species of host per beetle. In particular, ponderosa pines in the southwest have multiple species of bark beetle that will attack them. So for the most part, almost every ponderosa pine you look at in the southwest will have more than one type of bark beetle in it. What we find is that the bark beetles vary among elevation, tree diameter, location on the tree, for example, the top third of the tree or maybe the lower 6 feet of the bole, etc., just found in different places on the tree. And all of this varies among bark beetle species. So if you want to know what kind of bark beetle you're dealing with, you need to identify the host it is attacking, the size and shape of the beetle, and the egg galleries left in the tree. These egg galleries have a distinct shape and pattern for every bark beetle, further helping you identify the bark beetles that are doing damage to your trees. There are about 500 species of bark beetles in North America. They live under the bark and live and feed on the phloem of the trees they attack. Many of them also feed on a fungus that they carry with them. They are very small, about the size of a grain of rice, and range in size from 1 to 9 millimeters, but most are smaller and between 1 to 3 millimeters. The important genera to us in the southwest are Dendroctonus and Ips. Dendroctonus are known as the big tree killers, but they only account for about 3% of all bark beetles. These two genera can be identified by looking at their abdomens. The Ips in the picture on the bottom right are commonly called engraver beetles. They will have an abdomen with spines, which can be obscured by the hairs, like in this photo, but the number of spines and the formation and spacing of their spines will vary by species as well. While Dendroctonus, the beetle picture on the bottom left, has many common names, but they often have a more rounded abdomen that helps distinguish them from Ips. Okay, now let's briefly talk about their life cycle. Here is an image of a generalized life cycle of the southern pine beetle, which is a bark beetle we do have. Just note that the number of instars or larval stages can vary between species, but this is just a basic life cycle. So an adult or multiple adults will come into a tree, the female lays the eggs, and the eggs hatch. And you'll get a couple different larval stages where they get bigger in each stage. Then you have pupa, then the adults, and the adults will emerge after that. This entire life cycle, other than the brief period when the adults are flying to find new trees, occurs under the bark of the tree and not in the heartwood. The length of this life cycle will depend on the species. Some can be as short as 2 months, while others can be as long as a year to complete their entire life cycle. All right, now that we know some general facts about bark beetles, let's go ahead and discuss the signs and symptoms of a bark beetle attack. First, just a little refresher on the difference between a sign and a symptom. Symptoms are the general changes in a plant's growth or appearance in response to biotic or abiotic stressors, while signs are the evidence or proof of the damaging factor. So how do we know if a tree is being attacked by bark beetles? One of the first things people notice is the symptom of crown fading, and that occurs after the beetles have been in the tree, attacked the tree, and are now in the process of killing the tree. Earlier than the crown fading, you might be able to see the signs of their activity through the presence of pitch tubes. The presence of pitch tubes can depend on the species attacking the tree as well as the health status of the tree, but these pitch tubes are created from the tree defending itself against the bark beetle. They're using their resin to push the bark beetles out of the tree. However, when trees are drought stressed, they produce less resin. You can also find boring dust at the bottom of trees, or they can get caught up in cobwebs or spider webs that are in the crevices of the bark of the tree. Another symptom of bark beetle activity is woodpecker activity. As mentioned earlier, bark beetles are an important food source for woodpeckers, so They will go and flake off the bark of a tree to get to the beetles and more so the larvae. So how do beetles find the trees they want to attack? Well, how the first beetle finds a tree can vary among species, but in general it has to do with the beetles smelling the volatiles that the trees put out, and we know that the trees that are water stressed tend to have more ethanol and other terpenes. The smells the trees put out can change, so they orient to these smells. Some beetles may just find a tree by chance or land on a tree and taste test to know what host they've landed on. But once they land on the host species they're looking for, they send out aggregation pheromones that signal other beetles in the area to come to their area and find the tree they're in. They then mass attack the tree until the tree has no more defenses. Once the tree is filled up by those bark beetles, they then start beginning to produce an anti-aggregation pheromone that tells other beetles that the tree they're in is full, and these other beetles need to go find another tree to attack. And forest health professionals can actually use this anti-aggregation pheromone in some of their management techniques, which I will talk about a little bit more later on. But for now, let's go ahead and get into our bark beetle identification. So what are the common bark beetles we will find around Arizona? I'm going to begin by reviewing the bark beetles that attack ponderosa pines, and I'm going to start with ips. So these species attack stressed ponderosa pines. The first picture is Ips pinei, the Pine Engraver Beetle, which has 4 spines. In the middle there we have Ips lecontii, the Arizona 5-spined Ips, which as its name suggests, it has 5 spines. While Ips calligraphus, the 6-spined Ips, has 6 spines on its abdomen. You can't rely on their size to differentiate between these species, as they all have very similar size ranges. It's the number of spines that helps identify these beetle species. But what about the signs that these beetles leave behind in and on their host trees, which are ponderosa pine? The ips will leave behind fine, more orangey-colored frass, as shown in the photo. They will also create Y or star-shaped galleries that are frass-free and typically etched into the sapwood. Occasionally, there are very small pitch tubes associated with their attacks, but you will often also see BB-sized exit holes, and that is like BB as in like a pellet size, not bark beetle. Next is the western pine beetle, Dendroctonus barberi, formerly bravicowis. They are sometimes called the spaghetti westerns or the drunk beetle, as there is no pattern to their galleries. It's just meandering all over the place. So this is a small beetle that creates these distinguishable galleries, therefore they are a sign of the western pine beetle. As the larvae get older, they begin to mine away from the wood and get into the bark. So this leads to a common symptom from the western pine beetle, bark flaking from woodpecker activity. Next is the mountain pine beetle, Dendroctonus ponderosae. This is a less common bark beetle in Arizona, but it can be found in some of the northern parts of the state. So this bark beetle often has pitch tubes associated with their activity, so another sign that the bark beetle is present. But as mentioned earlier, pitch tubes can vary depending on the health status of a tree. These beetles create straight vertical egg galleries that are packed with frass. And the 2 main host species in Arizona for this bark beetle are ponderosa pines and white pines, 5-needled species. The round-headed pine beetle, Dentroctonus adjunctus, attacks ponderosa pine as well. Pitch tubes are a common sign of this bark beetle, and this beetle also creates vertical galleries that are much more snake-like in appearance than the mountain pine beetle egg galleries. The larval galleries are also packed with frass and are etched into the cambium tissue. All right, next is the southern pine beetle, Dendroctonus frontalis, and the Mexican pine beetle, Dendroctonus mexicanus. They both attack ponderosa pines, Chihuahua, and Apache pines. A sign associated with this beetle is the reddish-brown frass that they both create. Pitch tubes are often missing with this species as they are very small. They create maze-like galleries with branching and interconnections. The morphology, as well as the signs and symptoms of these two bark beetles, are so similar they're very difficult to tell apart. That's part of the reason I included them on the same page, that if you believe you have one of these two beetles, it would take an entomologist and a sample of the beetle for us to really be able to make that determination. The red turpentine beetle, Dendroctonus valens, creates large pink whitish colored pitch tubes on the lower portion of the bowl. So normally we see an accumulation of reddish brown sawdust or frass at the base of the tree and in the bark crevices as well. The egg galleries under the bark are fairly wide and linear to irregular in shape. The galleries extend downward from the entry holes and can even extend into the roots. The larvae feed in groups, so you may be able to see some group larval formations under the bark. Okay, now let's go over where you can typically find these different genera of bark beetles in the ponderosa tree. So I mentioned earlier that in addition to separating themselves out over elevation, they will also space themselves out in a tree. The pine engravers will attack either small diameter trees or the smaller diameter parts of a tree, the top third of the tree, for example, if it's a large tree. So if you're seeing small diameter trees being attacked or larger trees with ips in the top of the tree, and maybe if you're in a lower elevation, most likely you're probably going to be looking at Ips lecontii or the Arizona five-spined ips being your culprit. While the six-spined ips can be found closer to the bottom of big diameter ponderosa pines. Then there is the western pine beetle, the mountain pine beetle, and the roundheaded pine beetle, as well as the southern pine beetle, which are all typically found even lower on the bowl of larger diameter ponderosa pines. Lastly, at the very bottom of the ponderosa, like at the bottom 4 feet, is where you'll find the red turpentine beetles. So again, this is just kind of a nice way to help you break down, what kind of beetle you could be looking at based on the vicinity of the tree that you're finding, the beetle, the pitch tubes, the frass, all of those things that help you determine what beetle. Now knowing the location within the tree can help you better determine what beetle you're looking at. Okay, so with this slide, I just wanted to clarify what I meant in my last slide when I said that the beetles space themselves out over different elevations. So here we have this nice diagram that shows that if you're working in a lower elevation and you're seeing possible bark beetle damage, your most likely culprits are going to either be the Arizona five-spined ips, six-spined ips, the pine engraver, or possibly the southern pine beetle. If you're in a little bit of a higher elevation, more of a mid-elevation range, then you're possibly looking at the western pine beetle, still the southern pine beetle, as well as still possibly Ips pinei, the pine engraver. And then as you continue to increase in elevation, we're going to start seeing the round-headed pine beetle, the red turpentine beetle, the Mexican pine beetle, as well as the mountain pine beetle. And you can still see that the pine engraver, Ips pinei, its range still does extend into this higher elevation area as well. And I'd just like to reiterate one more time that, again, the mountain pine beetle isn't a huge player in our forests. It really does only create occasional damage. So this one is probably not going to be a very common one that you would see in the field. But again, it is still out there, but just not super prevalent. Now I want to go over other bark beetles that attack different species, tree species in Arizona. So I'm going to start with the Pinyon Ips confusus. This bark beetle has a pretty large geographic range and has caused widespread mortality in the state. It has 5 spines on the abdomen, and usually the third spine is larger than the others. So having spines on the abdomen and being found in a pinyon will help you determine it's a pinyon ips. It is a larger ips beetle that is brown in color, and pinyon ips do have a characteristic ips gallery. As you can see here in the picture, they have that star shape to them. Sometimes you will see pitch tubes associated with pinyon ips. It just depends on the health of the pinyon. As previously mentioned, again, drought-stressed trees aren't going to produce as much resin, so the pitch tubes can be hit or miss depending on the environmental conditions of the year. So a lot of the time, the first thing people will see is the fading crown. But before that, if you do go up to the tree, you'll most likely see boring dust as well, or the frass that we've talked about. It can be gathered around the base, or it can be found in the crevices of the bark. All right, here is the spruce beetle, Dendroctonus rufipennis, which attacks Engelmann spruce and blue spruce. The red boring dust from these beetle attacks will accumulate in the bark crevices around the base of an infested tree. The signs of pitch tubes can often be seen, and the symptoms of woodpecker activity frequently removes large sections of the bark when they're looking for larvae. This beetle creates vertical galleries with eggs laid on alternate sides of the gallery. So these galleries are grooved into the xylem tissue. The Douglas fir beetle, Dentroctonus pseudotsugae, is a small beetle that attacks Douglas fir. It creates reddish-orange frass, which is typically the first sign of their presence. This tree will produce a clear resin that exudes from the entrance holes. Again, the health of the tree can influence the presence of these pitch tubes. The Doug fir beetle creates egg galleries that run parallel to the wood grain. This is the western balsam bark beetle, Dryocoetes confusus. This is a different genera of bark beetle. The adults are shiny dark brown and the body is covered in hairs and the abdomen is spineless. It is a bark beetle that attacks subalpine fir. This beetle will create small entrance holes as well as create boring dust, but that dust can be difficult to detect sometimes. Pitch tubes can occasionally be evident as well, but as I keep mentioning, this is all dependent on the drought stress of the tree, thus the resin flow might not be that high. These beetles create egg galleries that are very lightly etched into the wood, and they have a star shape to them, where the egg galleries radiate from a central nuptial chamber. So again, even though these beetles, their galleries look similar to some of the ips galleries, based off of the species of tree that you're dealing with would help you determine that you're looking at the western balsam bark beetle, a Dryocoetes species, and not an ips species. This is the Fir Engraver, the Scolytus ventralis. This is again another different genera of bark beetle. This beetle doesn't have any hairs nor spines. However, this genera is easily identified by the scooped out appearance of their abdomen. They are very small as well, and they attack true firs. They may create a reddish-brown boring dust that you could find in the bark crevices. They also occasionally produce clear pitch that will exude from the entrance holes. And these beetles' egg galleries run horizontally, and they deeply score the wood, while the larval galleries run vertically and are less deeply etched into the wood. You can see that pretty nicely in this picture of their galleries. And lastly are the cedar bark beetles. These are Phliocinus species. There are several species that will attack junipers as well as Arizona cypress. Normally, the first sign of their attack is branch dieback, which will then lead to whole canopy dieback. Their egg galleries have a thermometer or centipede shape to them and are typically etched rather deep into the wood. It isn't known as an overly aggressive bark beetle, but it can build up during droughts. All right, now that we have went over the bark beetles that are present in Arizona, we can now briefly discuss some management options. Typically, the majority of management for these beetles occurs on a forest-wide level. However, as I'm asking for your help in urban environments, we're just going to go over management options for homeowners. I'd like to start by saying that when we talk about bark beetle management, we're not talking about killing every bark beetle out there. This just isn't possible. We know we cannot control the bark beetle, but we can manage our trees to be more healthy and less susceptible to the bark beetles that we know are present. So there are two different classifications of management. There is indirect management, which is really just prevention, and then there is direct management, which is suppression. With indirect management, we're talking about creating healthy forest stands. How can a homeowner create a healthy stand of trees on their property? They could start by increasing the diversity to this area. They could eliminate conditions that promote bark beetle outbreaks and attacks, such as the removal of slash or down trees or tree material in general. This down material produces chemicals that attracts the bark beetles to this area. As mentioned earlier, stressed trees produce ethanols and terpenes that the bark beetles can smell and then find these weak trees. Therefore, a homeowner can encourage the health of their current trees to minimize their stress, watering their trees in times of drought, possibly feeding them to help increase their nutrient uptake. All of this will help minimize that competition and decrease your tree's stress. With direct management, we are trying to influence current populations, so suppression. How can a homeowner reduce localized populations? They could put traps out to collect and kill beetles in a small area. They could use anti-aggregation pheromones, such as verbenone, to deter the beetles from their property. Or they could use chemical sprays or injections to kill beetles actively infesting their trees. But the easiest and best option, in my opinion, is the removal of infested trees or infested firewood or tree material in general, which leads me to my next slide. As many of the suppression options can be expensive and are typically more short-term solutions, the Arizona Department of Forestry and Fire Management wanted to help homeowners reduce their localized populations of bark beetles, so we created a program that helps pay for half the removal cost of actively infested bark beetle trees. It is our hope that this rapid response program can help private landowners near or adjacent to national forest lands and help reduce the spread of bark beetles. And now, hopefully, I can count on some of you to help me with this program by helping me identify active bark beetle infestations on private lands around the state. So I'd just like to end by saying thank you for sitting through this detailed presentation, and the Arizona Department of Forestry and Fire Management would like to thank you all for your support and help with moving forward with our Healthy Forest Cost Share program. Thank you again so much.
So thank you.
Oop. There we go. Sorry, I needed to mute my computer.
Yeah, thank you, Allie. I enjoyed that presentation. We learned all about all kinds of beetles, and I know we've got questions about the management and the Healthy Forest Cost Share program. One thing I want to share is several participants are with us who are looking to get their Society of American Foresters continuing education units. So for those who are doing that, please send me an email. I put ckjones@arizona.edu, and I will be sure to send you the attendee report information so you can get your credits for that. One thing also I'd like to share with people, just a quick little poll that I do, how you heard about this presentation. I send out an email to my listserv, and people have been sending me emails. I've been putting them on. They get forwarded. We put them on Facebook, and I've got some colleagues in the county who've been putting on the newspaper and radio. So getting a handful from the newspaper right now. So that's just great. And if you have an other, just go ahead and put that in the chat box, and I appreciate it. Let me see if I can open up my chat box here. I'm going to enter the evaluation link again. So if you see that there, open up that forms at Google form, give me a little information. Usually takes about less than a minute to take care of, and I really appreciate it. So some of the questions that we have here, let me scroll up. There will be a video link on YouTube for this. I put it at my website, Garden and Country Extension Webinars at the Gila County Extension webpage, and I'll have it up the next week. So many beetles. So Martin Reed is asking for a reference, either a text or extension publication for identification of bark beetles discussed today. Are you aware of what references we can use? Allie.
I'm sorry. You kind of cut out on that a little bit. I'm trying to pull up the question and answers to follow along with you.
Okay. So one is, Martin, I know that Tom DeGomez put together a Bark Beetles in Arizona extension publication that would be available. I don't think it's in the depth of bark beetles that Allie covered today, but do you have a reference or resource for more of those beetles?
Yeah, so also throughout the extension office does have some good links as well for some additional information on some of those beetles, but also there are some good IDs that the Forest Service has put together of insects and diseases throughout the Southwest. So if you have some questions, on how to maybe get one of those copies, feel free to reach out and I'd be happy to help work that out to get something like that to you. That's definitely a huge resource that we use a lot in the field.
Very good. And if you send that to me, I can put a link to it when I post this to the website so we can get to it. That'd be great.
Okay. Yeah.
I went ahead and promoted you, Kevin, so you can ask this next question about the alligator juniper. Here we go.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
Morning, and thanks for the presentation. That was awesome. I just had a question. I have an alligator juniper that actually had beetles in the heartwood. Is that maybe a bark beetle that did something different, or am I looking at a different kind of beetle?
If it's in the heartwood of the tree, then you would definitely be looking at a different type of beetle. And if I had to bet, was it probably a little bit larger size of a grub, not something fairly small? Was it creating fairly large galleries in that heartwood?
Yes.
Yeah, so that would definitely be more of a wood borer, not a bark beetle. So that definitely would be a different insect. And normally those would be something that would be more secondary. So that alligator probably was pretty stressed, had some other issues going on that brought in that wood borer.
Ah, okay. Also wanted to know if you fly the plane in your picture.
I do not fly the plane, thankfully.
Well, thank you very much for the presentation. It was very informative.
You're welcome.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. Next question from Kingson Lee. And I can promote, but just whether you can answer this question, says, which mountain has the most severe damage right now near Tucson these days? Is there some activity in Tucson that you're aware of?
We flew some of the mountain ranges down around Tucson, but some of them were left out due to the fires this summer as well. But actually, we didn't see as much activity this year as we have in the past few years. So the level of bark beetle activity in general, at least compared to last year, has begun to decrease. So as for which mountain would have the most beetle activity, they were all pretty minimal in comparison to the last few years. So, which is good, even with the extreme drought and everything that we are still going through right now, the beetle activity is actually decreased a little more down there. Did that answer your question?
I think that does. And Kangson, if not, just go ahead and let us know if you need to ask some more. Switching over to the Q&A, there is an anonymous attendee who says, you said that IPS tends to be on smaller trees or higher in the tree, but also that they are the primary beetles at lower elevations. What about large trees at low elevations? So a little bit more on the IPS beetle.
Yeah, so to begin, technically IPS aren't normally a primary beetle. They tend to be more of a secondary beetle, which means they prefer to find those already stressed trees, whereas a primary beetle attacks a perfectly healthy tree. That was like in that one of those first couple of slides I talked about the big tree killers, which mostly the Dendroctonus are the ones that attack green trees and are the primary killers. Or primary beetles. But the ips have become more of a primary beetle because of the droughts that we've been having around here for the last few years. So just to clarify, they're not normally a primary beetle, but they've kind of become one in some of those lower elevation areas. And we do still see them on the larger trees in lower elevations, but again, on those larger trees, you're going to find them on the smaller portions of those larger trees. So you're looking at more of the top, third of the tree, or possibly some of the maybe bigger branches, that are on the tree as well. So some of that material that's a little smaller diameter, but those larger trees at low elevations are still susceptible as well.
Very good, thank you. I've got Andy Mason. I've promoted you for that question if you want to unmute and ask Allie. Okay, Andy asks why it, go ahead, Andy.
Yeah, you may have mentioned this, Allie, but if you did, I missed it. I understand the mountain pine beetle is not prevalent here, but I've seen it in so many other places in ponderosa pine, so many other states. Why is it that mountain pine beetle just doesn't get to epidemic levels in Arizona?
I've had this conversation with a couple other people as well, and there's no real consecutive answer, but part of the thought is that, they definitely prefer lodgepole pine, and they prefer kind of the smaller diameter trees as well. And obviously the denser packed conditions too. And we still see it occasionally around here, and we're finding it in those smaller diameter, denser forest areas. But I think because we already, have so many other bark beetles in the area as well, it's just a, very competitive area, and not having those preferred species, I think kind of also deters them from really gaining that growth within our state. So they definitely are here, but they're, like you had mentioned, they're not as big of a player as they are in other Western states. And again, I think that kind of has to do with some of the lack of that preferred host within the state. But
because they can certainly do well in ponderosa pine on the Front Range of Colorado.
Yes, they can. And again, you definitely see them attacking those smaller, very dense stands, which Arizona, thankfully, I think around like the Flagstaff area, they've been managing their forests for so long now that even in areas that, have some of the smaller diameter trees, they've been managed for, the past easily almost 100 years with the forestry school and everything. They've been more on top of it. So I think with that little bit of an edge as well in management, I think all of those things have contributed to the mountain pine beetle not really being able to become as prevalent here.
Thank you.
Okay, we're going to move on to Izzy for the next question. And Izzy, I'll give you a chance to unmute and ask. And so Izzy's question is, what and where is the spine on the beetle? Is it circular around the body or horizontal from head to end?
Yeah, I would be happy to share a slide if you wanted. I could share one of the IP slides really quick. Here, go back to the PowerPoint. And we'll just go to one of the random IPS images here.
Or get to our 5 and 6 pen, yeah.
Yeah, so what you see is on that abdomen part, they have these little spines shooting out. So it's like the butt of the beetle there. And it's kind of hard to see in some of these pictures because the hairs on the abdomen do obscure those spines a little bit. But those are the spines that line the ridge there of their butt, basically. And so the spacing of those spines, the number of those spines, that is really your identifying factor for these if species. I don't know if you can kind of see that in the pictures, if that helped at all.
Yeah, you don't necessarily know where to look for those spines, so good question, Izzy. I'm gonna get up our next speaker here. Barry Barry, asked a really good question about the cost share program. And so, Barry, if you want to unmute, we can have you ask that. But I think this is one of the goals of this webinar is to bring people's attention about this. Go ahead, Barry.
I was wondering how long that cost share program has existed, and if you've already paid to get trees removed and have a receipt, can you still get reimbursed?
So this program is brand new. We actually just started it this year, so it's very new, still trying to get some of the kinks worked out. However, it is not a retroactive program. So if you recently had trees removed that did have bark beetles, we can't help pay for that cost. It is only for the active beetles that, we just don't do the retroactive. Unfortunately, there's just no way for us to really prove that this happened. It's just easier for us to be able to go look at the trees ourselves, yes, identify that they do have the bark beetle infestations, and then we can move forward with them participating in the program.
Great, thank you. It's an excellent program. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Barry. We have another anonymous question. What do you recommend for getting rid of the dead wood? Should it be burned, put it into community trash, shred and leave on the ground? What do we do with the dead wood?
Yeah, so if someone's not able to, maybe get the wood material off of their property, which that is what we try to do with the Healthy Forest Cost Share program. After we remove these trees, we actually have all of that material removed from the property itself as well to some kind of green refuse center somewhere close by that will be able to deal with that material. However, if you don't maybe have that option and you need to leave it at home, whether you want to use it as firewood or you want to use it as mulching material, if it does actually have an active bark beetle infestation in that material, then for firewood, honestly, the best way to still be able to utilize that is you have to debark all of that wood so that you're removing any of that habitable space for those bark beetles. So once you remove the bark, all of the adults and larvae that would be in that material then don't have anywhere, to continue to live, and they would wind up dying. If you wanted to turn that material into mulch, that would be easy as well, because you would chew up all that material that it wouldn't allow for the bark beetles to still survive in it. Also, if you decided to use mulch, you would probably want to figure out where you could place it somewhere on your property where it get as much sun as possible, because the other thing, as I mentioned in the PowerPoint, is that those beetles, they smell the ethanols and the terpenes that come off of that wood material. So when you mulch it, that smell brings in more bark beetles to the area. So what you want to do is give it as much sun as you possibly can to really dry it out as quick as possible so it releases all of those smells as quickly as it can, and then you can use it and spread it around your property and use it how you need to. But I would try to give it as much sun, maybe 2 to 3 weeks of direct sunlight, really let it dry out before using it. And I would recommend the same thing if you wanted to masticate or scatter, chip it or use it in bigger chunks as well.
Good question. Yeah, because just as you said, it can bring in beetles, and so you want to make sure that doesn't happen. Cindy, I've got you with a question. Go ahead.
Yes, I was wondering how active bark beetles are here in the San Francisco Peaks and in the Flagstaff area.
So San Francisco Peaks
Okay.
and Flagstaff.
Yes, so there is still current bark beetle activity going on around the area. There's multiple different bark beetles as well that you will see around Flagstaff, not only in the ponderosa pine, but as well as on some of the mountains, we are seeing bark beetle activity in the mixed conifers. I wouldn't say that it's severe. Again, like most of the rest of the state, we did see a decline in that bark beetle activity around Flagstaff compared to the last few years. So I think your question was if there's a lot. Not necessarily. I couldn't consider it an extreme year, and again, it has decreased from the previous years, but there is still present activity that you will see in some of the mountains around there. And you know, if you ever have questions and you want to take some pictures of something you're seeing, you know, and while you're out in the forest, I'd be happy to help you identify from afar.
Oh, okay. Thank you very much.
Great.
Yeah.
Next question is from Martha Strongen, or maybe a spouse. If the question, if you can unmute, we can ask that, but I'll go ahead and start it. With drought conditions in the forests, what is the best Forest Service plan to help forest resistance from bark beetles on this larger scale?
That's a tough question. On a forest-wide scale, you know, because we can't water by hand, obviously. So really your best management technique on a forest level is increasing that species diversity, so we don't have just these, you know, heterogeneous or, homogeneous forest is just like a single ponderosa, you know, is your only species for a couple hundred acres. You know, we need to minimize that, and we need to increase that species diversity so that the beetles have less posts that they can actually live and survive on. And then we also need to decrease the density. So we need to do more thinning and just removal to ensure that the trees aren't competing for the water and the nutrients that they need on a forest level, which as it gets warmer and, you know, if we have less water, less moisture, you know, that competition is going to become harder and harder on those trees. So they're going to need even more space to be able to get all of that nutrients and the water that they need in the drought. So, you know, it's a tough management option, but you know that it's not feasible to do chemical applications on a forest-wide level. You know, unfortunately we can't staple the verbenone pouches to every single tree in the forest. So really it does come down to the management of decreasing that stand density and increasing our species diversity.
Okay, any follow-up for that? Thank you. All right, Irene, I've got next. And Irene is asking, would a prescribed fire reduce the activity of bark beetles? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, so prescribed fire would definitely help. That would reduce the stand density and remove some of those smaller, probably, you know, more stressed out trees. When you have the smaller trees underneath some of the larger trees, they have a hard time getting the amount of sun that they need. Sometimes they wind up having, you know, odd formation. They just don't have the best qualities to them. And so prescribed fire is definitely is a huge help for that as well, with reducing that stand density. And occasionally it can help improve as well the species diversity, as aspen does have a tendency to come back in ponderosa pine stands where they've seen fire.
Thank you, Irene. Good question. Good answer. Next question is from Donna. And Donna is asking, is there a time of year? Go ahead, Donna.
Just is there a time of year that you should be carrying out some of the prevention stuff or the mitigation?
Yes, so definitely there are two time frames in the year that it's, you know, more safe versus less safe to be dealing with all of this bark beetle material. And so the fall is really your ideal time, fall and winter, to be removing those bark beetle infested trees. As the bark beetles are going into dormancy, and if they've produced a generation that will overwinter in the tree, then you will be able to remove that adult and all of the larvae generations that they have in that tree as well. And since it's in, you know, the fall and winter, those adults at that point don't have anywhere else to fly. They don't have the capabilities to try to find a new host at that point. It's just out of their life cycle range. So thankfulully, you know, it gives us a little bit of a break in the fall and winter to try to kind of catch up and remove some of that population, you know, by removing the infested material. Versus if you did this in the spring and early summer when they're actively flying, removing that material, the beetles are just going to leave the tree and fly to a new one. So it's a more hazardous time to remove that material versus the fall and the winter.
Okay.
All right, thank you, Donna. Next question is from Don Falk, and I'm sure Don's got this down, so go ahead.
Hi, thanks so much. I've just been curious about the presence of beetles in cut wood. You mentioned that all the beetles you talked about are phloem feeders, but in cut wood, I would think the phloem dies pretty rapidly and is certainly no longer conducting. So how are they able to persist in cut wood under those conditions? Thanks so much.
Yeah, one of the other things that beetles actually carry with them is a fungus. A lot of them carry it on their backs that actually infects the wood that they attack. So, you know, that also is what they're able to feed on in times where maybe they don't have a phloem that they're looking for. And on top of that as well, some of the larvae do actually move into the bark as they age a little bit. So they move away from the phloem and they do kind of shift their feeding habitats a little bit as well. So even in that cut material, they're still able to survive underneath the bark for at least a couple of months.
Totally fascinating. Thanks.
Thank you, Don. Okay, this is about to wind us down here. We got all our questions. Got one extra clarification about the spines extending from the butt end of the beetle. And just to explain, a beetle has those specialized wings, that hard shell on the outside called the
Elytra.
The elytra. And so it's that rear end of the elytra that you're going to see those spines coming out of. Hopefully that answers that question.
Yeah.
Okay. I am going to go ahead and start to shut this down here. I'm going to bring up my closing slides. And here is our presenter one more time, Allie McAlexander. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you everybody who's gone into the chat box, found the survey. I really appreciate your information. This has been our Q&A discussion with Allie. Thank you. Lots of great questions. And just like to bring people's awareness for our next webinar, next Thursday, I've got Jan Groth coming back, and Jan's going to tell us how to plant a tree. And if you've done this with Jan, she gets outside. It's a live demonstration. She's a lot of fun. So if you're having any doubt or just how to do it right in Arizona, it's going to be a lot of fun. So thank you so much, everybody. And we will see you all next week.